This is the Chapter 3 Stigma podcast. This podcast was created to be there for any individual who feels like they are at a low point in life and are confused, seemingly alone, and helpless in their situation. I am a recovering alcoholic, and I felt this way too, until I sat across the table from another addict who shared his story and made me realize that I was not alone in my struggles. My life was saved by this realization, and I hope to help anyone struggling by sharing my story to show you that you are not alone and that life can contain unbelievable riches and meaning. Welcome. I am glad you are here. Hey folks, welcome to another episode of the Chapter 3 Stigma podcast. And just to recap, we are in Chapter 2 titled, There is a Solution, of the Alcoholics Anonymous book. The next few pages of the chapter that we are going to cover are centered around a very high definition of an alcoholic. And is really the first opportunity for someone to hold a mirror up to themselves and up to their own behavior and really start asking, do I manifest these traits in my life, in my story? And really start driving at the core question of, am I an alcoholic? And I just want to say before we start, in my experience and in my story, I want to recognize that I danced around the word alcoholic and alcoholism for years. And it was something that I never wanted to speak and I never wanted to say. And I pushed people away who did use that word or words with regards to my behavior. And because of that, we, again, danced around it. We labeled my behavior anything and everything under the sun that didn't explicitly use the words alcoholic or alcoholism. Probably the most common being alcohol use disorder. And actually, if you dive into and read some literature and journals on addiction and alcoholism, they'll bring up alcohol use disorder. But in my experience, in all the reading that I've done, in all the suffering that I've gone through, in all of the addicts that I have become friends with and talked to and strove to understand, alcohol use disorder doesn't make any sense. Let's just call it alcoholism at this point moving forward. But I want to recognize the sting that that word brings with it and the pain and the appearance of failure. But I just really want to highlight that it is not failure to be an alcoholic. It is not something to be ashamed of, to be shameful of. So because of that, I am going to extensively and specifically use the term alcoholic and alcoholism as we move through this entire series. If you don't use a word, you give it more power. And I have discovered that by using the word alcoholic in relation to myself and the condition and the illness that I have, it has given me more power rather than the word. So with that, we will go to the book. It is the purpose of this book to answer such questions specifically. We shall tell you what we have done. Before going into a detailed discussion, it may be well to summarize some points as we see them. How many times people have said to us, quote, I can take it or leave it alone. Why can't he? Quote, why don't you drink like a gentleman or quit? Quote, that fellow can't handle his liquor. Quote, why don't you try beer and wine? Quote, lay off the hard stuff. Quote, his willpower must be weak. Quote, he could stop if he wanted to. Quote, she's such a sweet girl. I should think he'd stop for her sake. Quote, the doctor told him that if he ever drank again, it would kill him. But there he is, all lit up again. I just want to pause here because I just want to recognize how exceedingly difficult and frustrating, even in my situation right now, it is to read through those statements. Because when I was suffering, when I was at my low points, when I was at my lowest points, I knew all of these statements were legitimate. And I didn't understand why it was that I could not stop. My plan is to actually do a fairly extensive dive into a lot of these, I guess what I would call like typical reactions of a non-alcoholic to an alcoholic's behavior and thought patterns. So I'm going to leave this here at this moment, but I do plan on coming back because these are, from the alcoholic's perspective, these are statements that drive us to insanity because we know that there's truth in them. We know that there is capability within us, or should be capability, to, leave alcohol alone. Yet we prove time and again that we are incapable of doing such things. And that fact drives a person crazy and drives them nuts, and it will drive them into a drinking spree or a binge. So with that, back to the book. Now, these are commonplace observations on drinkers, which we hear all the time. Back of them is a world of ignorance and misunderstanding. We see that these expressions refer to people whose reactions are very different from ours. Moderate drinkers have little trouble in giving up liquor entirely if they have good reason for it. They can take it or leave it alone. Then we have a certain type of hard drinker. He may have the habit badly enough to gradually impair him physically and mentally. It may cause him to die a few years before his time. If a sufficiently strong reason, ill health, falling in love, change of environment, or the warning of a doctor becomes operative, this man can also stop or moderate, although he may find it difficult and troublesome and may even need medical attention. But what about the real alcoholic? He may start off as a moderate drinker. He may or may not become a continuous hard drinker. But at some stage of his drinking career, he begins to lose all control of his liquor consumptions once he starts to drink. Here is the fellow who has been puzzling you, especially in his lack of control. He does absurd, incredible, tragic things while drinking. He is a real Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I'm going to pause there for a moment and just go back to the part about that covers the aspect of every alcoholic's journey where the threshold is crossed. And I've gone into the threshold in previous episodes, but I just want to detail it here again. Really, the three driving forces that create an alcoholic are genetics, which you have no control over, the culture in which you are raised and of which surrounds yourself, and then finally, trauma, and in a little more detail, how you are able to cope with and deal with trauma and traumatic events in your life. You don't need aspects across all three forcing functions that lend themselves to alcoholism. One of them can be strong enough to push you over the threshold and make you an alcoholic and make you an alcoholic for life. And that's really the point that I want to make here on this section is I have become entirely convinced in my time in active recovery and with my story and with my life that I will never overcome alcoholism. I can never be cured of this disease, but I can live in an incredible way with it. If I ever find myself thinking that I can reintroduce alcohol into my life, that is the beginning of the end for me. Of that, I am entirely convinced. So I'm going to go back to the book. He is seldom mildly intoxicated. He is always more or less insanely drunk. His disposition while drinking resembles his normal nature but little. He may be one of the finest fellows in the world, yet let him drink for a day and he frequently becomes disgustingly and even dangerously antisocial. I'm going to pause there because I just want to emphasize how strong the drive to isolate is when you find yourself in the situation where you truly are an alcoholic. You become ashamed, you become shameful of who you are, of your problems, of not understanding any of it. And that, at least in my case, led me to push people away and really isolate myself in a valid attempt to try to figure out what was going on and also to minimize the pain and anguish and suffering that I was bringing into other people's lives. In a weird way, it almost became this kamikaze attempt where I knew that I was headed for destruction and near certain death, and I didn't want others along on the ride with me, and so I pushed them away and I isolated. Back to the book. He has a positive genius for getting tight at exactly the wrong moment, particularly when some important decision must be made or engagement kept. He is often perfectly sensible and well-balanced concerning everything except liquor, but in that respect, he is incredibly dishonest and selfish. He often possesses special abilities, skills, and aptitudes, and has a promising career ahead of him. He uses his gifts to build up a bright outlook for his family and himself, and then pulls the structure down on his head by a senseless series of sprees. I'm going to pause there and just reflect back on really, despite the isolation that I was creating in my life, I still strove to have an outward appearance of having things put together. I did believe that I had incredible potential within me. And I think in some cases and in some aspects of my career and my life, some of that potential was being actualized. And I was learning, I was growing, I was advancing. But there was this constant chipping away at the foundational structure of the entire facade that I was putting out as I continued drinking and as I continued isolating. And the isolation, that difference between the front that you were putting on for the rest of the world to see and what you were experiencing and living in actuality, because there was such a large gap and delta there, the only way to tie the two together was to lie. And that aspect of lying and building this false narrative that may have started innocently enough, and quite honestly, for me, it started with sneaking drinks at at a bar amongst friends. But, as we were kind of keeping tallies and tabs on each other, like figuring out ways to consume just a little bit more. And when asked after a night where I lost control, well, how many drinks did you have? I don't think I ever told the truth. And so those small lies opened an avenue for which the bigger lies were allowed to go through, and the ability to lie just grew and grew. And at the end of the day, one of the largest aspects of that created the lowest point in my life was absolutely the alcohol and the alcohol consumption. But right along with it, almost in parody, was the fact that I had created such a web of lies that I could not keep up and I could not manage it anymore. And so a huge part of the relief that has come along in being in a life of active recovery is that I don't have to lie anymore. And I don't have to remember who I told what when. And I don't have to worry about different individuals or different groups coming together and speaking together and realizing that they were given different versions of the story and largely like the reasoning for my behavior being the way that it was. And so an incredible aspect of the relief that I have found in this last year plus is all I have to do is speak the truth as I see it. And that's all I have to worry about. It's an incredible freedom and relief, especially after over a dozen years of living in and crafting a lie. Back to the book. He is the fellow who goes to bed so intoxicated he ought to sleep the clock around. Yet, early the next morning, he searches madly for the bottle he misplaced the night before. If he can afford it, he may have liquor concealed all over the house to be certain no one gets his entire supply away from him to throw down the waste pipe. I'm going to pause there. This is an incredibly common thread and behavior that exists across alcoholics. Nearly everyone that I spoke to had their hiding place in their house, their secret stash spot that nobody knew about. And maybe they use it to pull beers or drinks from to resupply the kitchen fridge, the common kitchen fridge. So their significant other didn't realize how much they were actually consuming. So they could have, say, double the amount while looking like they were keeping it reasonable. Or in my case, I just straight up hid everything that I was consuming. And it would grow, the empties would grow to such a volume that I would have to make a significant garbage run where I couldn't even put it in my regular garbage can. I had to go to some park to throw it away, as pathetic as that is. The incredible aspect about my experience after I found myself on the road to recovery, and it ties to what I was talking, it ties in with this point as well as what I was talking to previously about the lies, was coming out of rehab, I would have occasionally nightmares. And this is pretty common when you step away from a substance that you have been abusing, alcohol, obviously, in my case. And many people will have what are commonly called using dreams, where they will find themselves in situations where they're using their drug of choice, and they will wake up with just this fear and this feeling of guilt in their gut, only to realize that it was just a dream. Since I gave up alcohol, I have never actually had a dream where I was consuming alcohol, yet the nightmares that I did have since entering a life of active recovery are finding empties and figuring out that I was still living in this lie that I had created. Those are my nightmares, not consuming actual alcohol, but discovering that and realizing that I am still living in a lie. And that will cause me to wake up with just this instant wave of like guilt and just terror. And it is such a relief to figure out and find that, no, I'm not living in that space of just constant lying anymore. Back to the book. As matters grow worse, he begins to use a combination of high-powered sedative and liquor to quiet his nerves so he can go to work. Then comes the day when he simply cannot make it and gets drunk all over again. Perhaps he goes to a doctor who gives him morphine and some sedative with which to taper off. Then he begins to appear at hospitals and sanitariums. One item to note there from my story is just something I've covered before, but the tremors that I experienced coming down from a bender or detoxing. And many times, well, almost all of the time, these tremors are, and the pursuit of quieting them and taming them is what continued a bender for me. So I would wake up very early and I didn't sleep. And I would have drinks to, quote, quiet my nerves, but it was truly just to stop the shaking from happening. And then because I'm an alcoholic, as soon as the alcohol hit my system, I wanted more and I had to figure out how to get more. And the hellish cycle started all over again. And back to the book. This is by no means a comprehensive picture of the true alcoholic, as our behavior patterns vary. But this description should identify him roughly. And we are going to stop there as the next section of the chapter starts getting into the why behind some of this. So I appreciate you all following along. I do want to make one note. If you are clamoring for more here, the reason I'm able to read so much of what I'm reading right now is this is a publicly available document. So if you want more and you don't want to wait for the episodes to come out, just Google Chapter 2 Big Book or Chapter 2 Alcoholics Anonymous, and the entire copy will be made available for you. Just to kind of let you know if you're unfamiliar with the book, Chapter 2 is on the solution, and Chapter 3 does a deep dive into alcoholism, which is what we'll cover next. So if you're clamoring for more, I would recommend those as a starting point. Obviously, with the podcast, my intention is to layer on aspects of my story with all of this on top of what's been written. So that's all I've got for this week. Appreciate you all. Sending all the love out there. Take care. If you enjoyed this podcast, share it with others or give us a rating on your channel of choice. My hope is that my story can help others in their struggles with addiction or any other aspects of life that they feel could be bettered. You can follow us on social media at Chapter 3 Stigma on Instagram and YouTube. I cannot solve your problems for you, but I can listen. If you want to reach out with a message through one of those channels, I will respond and let you know that you are not alone. All the best, you are loved, and life is worth every struggle and bit of suffering you have to endure. Until next time,